Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about the differences between understanding content versus memorizing it, some ways to think about that, and why this has been a personal game changer for me and my approach to studying. Hi guys, my name is Chris Lovejoy, and welcome to this first video in my series of videos on productivity and study techniques. Over the next few videos, I'm going to share the techniques that I found most useful for learning new content, retaining that understanding of content, and also some principles just to facilitate the whole studying process. So over the last 9 years, I've done a few different types of degrees. I initially did a medical degree at Cambridge University, then worked for 2 years as a doctor, and more recently, I'm doing a degree in machine learning. And all of these have presented different types of challenges, and throughout this time, I've managed to get a fair amount done, as well as doing pretty well in the exams themselves. And I put this down to having spent some time trying to develop the most efficient, productive ways to study and to organize my time. So in this series of videos, I just wanted to share some of the techniques that have been most helpful for me and the hope that they will also be helpful for some of you. With that being said, let's get on with the videos. I hope you enjoy. So the idea is that if you memorize something, you're able to recall that information, but you don't necessarily understand why that fact is true, for example. Whereas if you understand something, it means that you're able to rework it out from first principles. So using a medical example, someone could tell you that the kidney is involved in regulating blood pressure. And you can know that as a fact and you can memorize that. And maybe if someone asks you a week later, what organ regulates blood pressure? You would say the kidney. But actually, maybe in like a year or two's time, you might not still remember that because the memory is somewhat more fragile than the alternative, which is if you understand how or why the kidney regulates blood pressure. So if somebody explains to you that the kidney regulates blood pressure and they explain the way that it does this by filtering out water and salts and then reabsorbing the water and salts in the right amount, and that then regulates blood pressure, it means that you're more likely to be able to remember that in the long term. And the idea behind this is that you can kind of rework out the fact from first principles. And that just makes it easier for you to then recall that memory. And it also makes the memory more robust and likely to last a bit longer. But the tricky thing is that it's easier to memorize something rather than truly understand it. And so often, at least I found that my brain just wants to memorize something and then kind of move on. And it does all these tricks to try and make me think that I understand it, but actually I've just memorized that fact. If I test myself on that knowledge a week or so later, I might not remember it particularly well, and I might kind of stumble around with trying to recall exactly how it works. Because the memory fades, and I can't then recreate that from the understanding. But I've noticed that when I proactively make an effort to try and understand the content rather than just memorize it by techniques that I'll explain in this video and the next few videos, the memory lasts much longer and I'm able to recall it even years or a long way down the line. And I really like the analogy from this author called Tim Urban, who blogs at a website called Wait But Why, which is a fantastic website. If you're interested, definitely worth checking it out. So I'll read out what the analogy is that he gives. He says, "I've heard people comparing knowledge of a topic to a tree. If you don't fully get it, it's like a tree in your head with no trunk. And without a trunk, when you learn something new about a topic, a new branch or a leaf to the tree, there's nothing for it to hang on to, so it just falls away. But by clearing out the fog all the way to the bottom, I build a tree trunk in my head, and from then on, all new information can hold on, which makes that topic forever more interesting and productive to learn about. And what I usually find is that so many of the topics I've pegged as boring in my head are actually just foggy to me, like watching episode 17 of a great show, which would be pretty boring if you didn't have the tree trunk of the backstory and the characters in place." And my experiences can definitely support this. One thing that I found when I was studying medicine is that it is a very content-heavy subject, so there's a lot of material that you need to learn, and often actually the advice is just to memorize things and not necessarily to understand them. And there's definitely an element of that where I think you do just need to memorize the content, but actually in a lot of subjects, it's actually very useful to understand the content rather than just to memorize it. And I certainly found in my personal experiences that memory lasted a lot longer. And this guides my approach to learning new content. So when I first come across a new concept, my priority is always to understand it and to highlight the areas where I don't understand it and fix those, rather than just to try to memorize things. And of course, it's not always going to be possible to develop a deep understanding of a subject the first time that you visit it. But the approach I therefore take is to iteratively come back to the subject and keep on repeating it to go deeper and deeper into that understanding. And I deliberately time box the amount of time that I have to try and be as efficient as possible. But I always feel that natural inclination when I first approach a subject to just try and memorize some of the concepts, but I force myself not to focus on that and to focus on the understanding, knowing that actually that will lead me to remember the content better as well. But I don't want to labor this point too much, and I'll talk a bit more about in the next few videos exactly the approach that I take in order to develop this understanding and to force myself to do that. Now, the second thing that I do after I've developed that understanding is that I'll look to consolidate that understanding in a way that I can refer to in the future and that I can then use to maintain that understanding in the long term. Because there's nothing more frustrating than spending ages trying to understand a topic, coming back to it a few weeks later and realizing that actually you can't really remember exactly how it worked. So I have this review system which follows principles of spaced repetition, which again I'll talk about in a later video. And I find that super effective to enable me to then kind of keep on maintaining that understanding in the long term. And I set myself up with the central resource so that I always have somewhere to hop straight back into to recap my current understanding and develop further understanding. And that's really useful because it just saves me time fumbling around with a subject that I haven't looked at for a few weeks. Anyway, if this sounds somewhat vague, then I'll go into a bit more detail about the specific strategies for each of these stages that I use in the next few videos. So be sure to check those out, and I'll see you in the next video.